So we had, I think, a fascinating panel. The first panel was which introduced us to the economic processes and history of both Turkey and Israel. I think was fascinating and gave us an excellent basis for the rest of this workshop, and from which we can continue to dive into more concretely the topic of privatization and privatization processes in both Turkey and Israel. And I think we've already learned that there are interesting and important parallels, obviously also differences, and I can only think of two main themes that parallel based on what we have already heard. One concerning the fact that actually privatization and the expansion of privatization policies is part of a wider, like in many other countries, part of a wider phenomenon, part of a wider move, some would say, institutional transformation towards economic liberalization, introduction of market forces, and neoliberalism. And the other thing, I think, which is also very interesting and maybe not too surprising, is the fact that in both cases changes are connected with crisis, with economic crisis. And I think one of the interesting questions always concerning crisis and change that happens after crisis, to which degree is a crisis, is the change following the crisis represent something that had to be done in order to actually fix the system and so on and so forth, or otherwise is it actually any political opportunity, crisis as a political opportunity to implement certain ideology and promote certain political economic interests. And I think we would be able to learn something about that from this session, again, on the privatization process in Turkey and Israel, in which two distinguished scholars of both Turkey and Israel would present us, in relatively general terms, the privatization processes that happened in both countries. We begin with the presentation of the Turkish case and continue with that of the Israeli case. The presentation of the Turkish case would be done by Professor İzzettin Önder from Istanbul, and then the presentation of the Israeli case by Professor Yitzhak Galnur from Jerusalem, from the Jerusalem Institute. So we begin with Professor İzzettin Önder, who is a lecturer. He's a professor at Boğaziçi, I hope I pronounced it right, Boğaziçi University and Mimar Sinan University in Istanbul, and he would, the title of his presentation is A General Approach to Privatization in Turkey, Aims, Implementations, and Probable Results. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I'm very glad to be here with these distinguished colleagues here to discuss the privatization problem regarding Turkey's and Israel cases. And, well, first I would like to begin by saying that if everything can be explained as how it appears, then we don't need an area called science. Because science asks always how and why. So if we say only, this has happened as such, the trend is as such, this is data, a valuable data, it's very important, but it's not science. Because the science asks always questions, and the concept philosophy comes from here, we know. Philein means asking everything, reason for everything. So if we don't find the reason for everything, for every idea, for every data, we can't see behind what is behind it, and therefore we can't take our measures accordingly to go to the core of the issue in the way of correcting it or maybe changing in the way we want to change it. It is therefore important to speak, to put everything here from my viewpoint, the core issue. I would like to try to do that in a solid form. So I think you have collected this handout, if you have all of these handouts, so we can see everything here. I'm a public finance man. I teach public finance and the government expenditure, taxation, etc. I'm Istanbul University man, but I'm an emeritus professor. Now I'm teaching another 2 state universities in Istanbul, and I'm not attending foundation-based universities. Anyway, this is another problem. Now, in Turkey, privatization, not only in Turkey, in all countries, privatization is carried out or implemented in governmental units, not in the private sector. But the effects are going to the private sector. So first we have to put under the focus the governmental units, the core sector and the state economic enterprises. In the core sector, there are 2 sub-segments, and that can be called fundamental sector, where only pure public goods are produced, where the privatization can be implemented only in the form of contracting out to the private sector. Because the production can be carried out to the private sector, shifted to the private sector, but the provision should be public, certainly public, because of the free rider problem. Now, this is the core, the fundamental sector in the core area. In the core area, there's another sector where nationalized services, mostly health, education, social insurance, various other commodities or services mostly are produced. Those services are, of course, going to the beneficiary and creating benefit to the beneficiary, but also creating social benefit going to the public, to the society generally. So therefore, they should be partly financed by the government, but it can be provided, I mean, privately. But under income distribution problem, if there is unbalance in the income distribution, then this should cause some problems, of course, so this should not be done. So now what happens in this core sector if we privatize, whether only for production or production and provision? Now, first of all, the first thing appears there is a reward going to one productive factor or production factor. That is to the entrepreneur. That is profit. So when a service is produced or a commodity is produced in the public sector, giving all other things constant, quality, etc., everything constant, so the cost would be much more lower because there won't be profit there in the public sector. But in the private sector, there is a profit. So when you left to the private sector, there is a profit which increases, either increases the cost to the government because the government would be paying eventually, or there might be a deterioration in the quality of the service, or the cost may be shifted to the labor. Anyway, for de-unionization, sorry about that, or less amount of labor would be employed, and unqualified labor would be employed. So all these would be reflected to the quality of the service. This is very, very important. Therefore, as a public finance man, I'm not in favor of privatizing all these services. They can be improved, of course. There are some problems, but they can be improved. When we come to the state-owned enterprise, SOEs, they are private. And in Turkey, they are also privatized. Then before coming to this area, in the first area, what happened in Turkey? Very, very, I mean, shortly, just passing over them. What happened in Turkey? Well, we privatized education. We privatized health. My colleague would tell us, would inform us about the privatization or the result of privatization in health services. And it is just horrible. The result is horrible. Everything is, I mean, decaying, the quality of service is decaying, etc. Now, in education, it is very important. I mean, we have two part of two-stage or two-segmented education, and also two-segmented health services in Turkey. So when you have two-segmented area, whether it may be education or health service or another service, then it's unavoidable that the private produced and or provided service or the section would attract the other section. So the result would be the deterioration in the other sector. For example, when you come to the hospitals and health services, where the private and the public, in the private, so all the rich people go, and of course they are willing to make very high amounts of payments, but they get comfort, not the service in essence in most of the cases. Now what happens? Most of the doctors are being attracted and have been and still are being attracted to the private sector. So it means, in general and eventually it means that we are putting some bans in the services to going to the poor and low-income groups. This is a kind of rationing of the service going to the low-income groups. It's not fair. So would they say that would increase the productivity of the service? It is not. Certainly, I'm saying it is not increasing. So when you come to the state-owned enterprises, I'm passing very, very quickly because in this handout there's everything, so I will be glad to answer your questions in all these issues. Come to the state economic enterprises. Now what happens? Well, again, we see some of the profits to the private sector. For example, a big refinery sector, or unit, sorry, was privatized, it was bought by a very big Turkish company in collaboration with Shell company, an international company. Now what happened? It was one of the most important company and giving income or raising income to the general budget at the very top level, but now this profit is going to the private sector. So this profit would be used for the public service or public purpose. Now it's going for another service, another aims. Whatever the aim is, I really do not know. Another thing is, during evaluation, at the stage of privatization, evaluations are mostly made very, very low. So this low evaluation during privatization means that a kind of windfall gain is earned or got by the private sector. This is a kind of capital accumulation, but not in the way of making production and getting, profit, and out of profit making the capital accumulation, but just simply getting turning over the public wealth to the private units. So in the wealth, in the way of creating capital accumulation. This is not capital accumulation, it is capital shift. Because the capital accumulation would be spoken in the sense of society. The society is not accumulating capital here, but it's just shifting the capital from one sector, let's say the public sector, from the general public to the private sector, to an area in the private sector. Now, that's all. So now, shall we carry out, or will be after this kind of policy? Now, in front of such distinguished colleagues, I would like to pose some issues, and in the way of trying, for the purpose of trying or checking my own idea, what I have here in my mind, and would like to see if it is right or wrong. Well, relative, of course, there is no such thing as right and wrong in science, speaking scientifically. All right, what happened after privatization? First of all, what is privatization? Are we dealing with some detailed area in a very, ramified subsector? For example, maybe privatization is one of the subsectors, the others being for globalization, financialization, etc. So if that is so, we must go to the upper level and try to see what is it from? Is it emancipating from? Where does it come from? How it happened that now what we are trying to privatize nowadays had been publicized maybe 50 years ago, after the Second World War, mainly, we know all these things, right? And they've increased the size of the public sector. I mean, in all countries, those countries were capitalist. And they weren't any suffering from shortages, like, for example, capital shortage or human resource shortage. They weren't suffering from anything of that sort. So why did they then publicize then? Who forced that? And now, which force is now forcing us again, right? Or now to privatize all these things. If they are so unproductive throughout the Second World War up to 1970s, let's put it this way, 1970s, if we had really lived throughout this period, an unproductive period, now all the economists getting Nobel Prizes, what did they say to us? Why didn't they just make the suggestions that we are living in an unproductive area? So I think there must be another problem here. So when we look what happened after, so we have made an experiment. In the social side, we can't control the experiment that we can make in chemistry and physics. But we have made, we have made such an experience. But very roughly, of course. From 1970s up to now, about 30 or 40 years passed. So we know the result nowadays. So we can say that we know the result, and we have the result, so we can come to a conclusion as to what the result is. So we're not speaking about probability, but we are speaking, I'm sure, what is it, right? So there is a book now published and issued very, very recently. That's The Life After Privatization. Well, it says in the world, there are the companies, not only in Turkey, maybe in Israel, but in the world, all the companies, the big companies, are now classified under two headings. Then we have the increased amount of alphas. This gentleman calls them alphas. There are big companies, and becoming bigger are bigger. And on the other side, there are the betas. They are smaller companies and becoming smaller and smaller. Because the alphas are going to buy them or to push them out of the market, etc. So that is the result. So we have alphas and betas. Another thing is, well, in the before session, some gentleman, well, I don't know if our friend, anyway, mentioned about the competition. And during this privatization, increased competition, that would increase our economic well-being. If that is correct, well, well, what would you say about South Korea, for example? Malaysia, for example. Well, they had competition. South Korea was, implemented a kind of protective policy, import sanctioning policy, but open some sectors to the world trade. So that means that this country implemented a kind of controlled competition. There is competition with the world, companies all over the world, but in a nation state. So that means that in a nation state, there is a nation or the state behind it. And last thing, because I'm not going to use much time, because I would like to get your opinion. Well, what is this policy all about? If this policy is in a basket, what is the tag on the basket? What does it say? It says that what you are doing, it's saying to us, what you are doing is you are simply privatizing the state. Let alone the companies and the government sector. You are privatizing the state. And who said this? Professor Kochwitz. Professor Kochwitz's idea is that in old times, we used to have a kind of telocracy, telocratic state forms. It means that the state has some aims, a kind of social aims for the income distribution, regional distribution or balance, and the growth and development, and inflation, or whatever the problem you can have. And states may pursue such policies, fiscal policies, economic policies, or planning, whatever it is, depending on the period that you are dwelling, right? You can follow these. So you can either succeed or not. Anyway, this is another problem. What is the period now? It's not telocracy anymore. It's nomocracy. So there is no purpose or the idea or aid the government should follow now. All right then. Who will decide on our destiny as a society? Income distribution, or balance of payments problem, or employment problem, or I mean labor work, whatever the problem is, or the capital would decide on this. All right, if you leave all these things to the capital, are they equal to each other? No, you decide on this, so I'll try to get your idea and try to check my own view. I mean, what I read to check with all these distinguished colleagues here. They are not equal to each other. They are not equal to each other. So they are pursuing their own aims. This, we don't know it now. This we know from in 1776. This Adam Smith said this to us. In his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, well, he said, in a famous chapter on the rent on land, he's saying that the tradesman, he said the tradesman, or because there used to be tradesman then, yeah, tradesman, a wealthy person, or the capital, let me translate as such with the capital. Capital's interest is in conflict with the social interest. He says this in 1776. And he says at the same time, goes on, that they pursue their interest, but they don't pursue it by themselves. They try to get all the laborers and all the rest of the society under their command and service to pursue their aims or ideals or targets as if it is their aims or ideals. If we know this from 1776, and if about 300 years or more than 300 years pass, and if we know all the giant firms like Shell Company, Mobil Company, various other companies, and Volkswagen's buying various other companies, I mean, as economists, now are we on the side of the general population, of the public, general public, the society, or are we on the side of the capital? So if the capital, last 5 minutes, sorry about that. So therefore, I think we must discuss this issue. Then we can discuss the globalization, financialization. One last word is that privatization, in my opinion, again, would like to get your opinion, is the same thing as globalization, financialization, and social democracy. Why did we have social democracy from Bismarck on? We have social democracy just for the same reason as why then Bismarck introduced social democracy, because he was afraid of the Paris Commune, right? Why we have democracy? We used to have democracy. Because we are afraid something, because we needed capital, it's very important, and because they are labor force. There used to be a labor force. Are they a labor force now? No. Are we afraid of something now, in quotation? No. All right, but we need market. I mean, not we, but capital needs market. But we have market, all over the market, because that's globalization. So therefore, globalization is a continuation of social democracy, right? And we have now financialization, right? And so privatization is the concurrence of the capital, state, which should be, it's not certainly for the society, state is not for the population. Well, I know this as a public finance man, like a James O'Connor idea. But again, though, in order to get vote, he might consider the society to some extent. But now it is conquering, I mean, the capital is conquering the state, right, against the whole general society. Thank you very much for listening to me.